Hey, good afternoon. Today we're going to talk about unethical behaviors of educators. So, this is a growing problem that we've had. It's especially because of the use of social media, the internet, online activities. That's one of the reasons that it's gotten progressively worse. So, the first one we're going to talk about is inappropriate sexual behavior between educators and students. So, when I did my research, I found that one way to deter teachers was to have good professional development, not just for the teachers, but also for the administrators, for the superintendent, all the way down, even through the board members. And if we train them, then they're able to take it back and train their teachers. Also, good model teachers, good teacher leaders in your school that understand the law, that understands that the law is ever changing, is a good way to prevent that. Also, local policies that address communication. Now, you're going to see this again on the next slide, but if you have policy that addresses do not communicate with your students on your personal phone, do not communicate with personal email, no phone calls, everything through school-based technologies, platforms. Also, inappropriate relationships can be grouped into three different categories. You have relationships that can start in a classroom between a teacher and a student. You have relationships, that's called intra-school academic relationships. You also can have intra-school extracurricular activities, those relationships between coaches and players. Not just athletic coaches, but also between like your Scholar Bowl coach and those players. Then you also have interpersonal and non-school related relationships. This would be like in our county, we recently had someone who was a sub through Will Sub that actually had some sexual intercourse with some of our students. And that came from her being in the school. And then it was an outside activity, but she met them in the school building. Then when we look at social networking with your educators, the first thing to know is that by age 12, 50% of students have some type of device. And a social media account, 83% have cell phones. So 50% by the age 12 have a social media account and 83% have cell phones. But here's the number that got me. 70% admit to hiding online activity from their parents. So that's one way that teachers and students who communicate on these platforms don't get caught, is because the kids hide it from their parents. So, policies that you implement in your system, you should be sure that communication with students and parents are through system-sponsored platforms. You should also communicate through your school email, not your personal email. And then no communicating through social media platforms. Don't friend your students, don't follow your students, don't allow them to follow you. My personal Facebook page is set up so that if someone tags me in a post, I have to approve for it to go on my timeline. I don't want things that are offensive to me personally, but could be offensive to students, to show up on my Facebook page. And so I have those privacy settings set like that. So that's one thing, is to be sure that you check your privacy settings. And then cheating on state assessments by educators. Every time I'm trained to give a test, whether it be work keys, ACT, any of those things, I always look at the fact that it says don't read the questions out loud. So, but with this, in 2001, No Child Left Behind was put into effect. And that caused a lot of teachers to worry about their job stability, especially in low-income, lower-performing schools, when their pay was tied directly to their job. You know, you get a raise if you do better, you lose your job if your students don't perform well. And so No Child Left Behind in my opinion, played a big part in that. So in Atlanta, 11 teachers were convicted of racketeering. Now that's usually reserved for the mob, but they've decided that because it was from the superintendent down, that it was a good thing that it was racketeering, that it met those criteria. And 11 of the 200 actually did jail time for that. And so then you have the New York's Regent exam. And in that exam in New York State, the students who were close to passing, teachers were allowed to go in and rescore their test. So, and up until 2010, the instructor who gave the test was the one who scored the test. So they instructed the student, they then gave them the test, and they then scored the test. And when you have grades, test scores, especially state assessments that are changed, that it harms the students. because they're not able to receive the intervention that they need. If they had not passed the Regents exam, then they would have been intervened with and hopefully brought them up so that they could pass it at a later date. Same thing with your ARMP testing, with all the new states testing that we're doing, with ACT. If the students don't meet those criteria, then they would receive some kind of extra help. And so they don't get that if they're changing those test scores and those test scores are not accurate. So those are just 3 of the things that we looked at today. If you have any questions,